everybody. Thank you for tuning into this latest episode of the Federalist Files. We will be covering Federalist number 25. It is titled "The Same Subject Continued, the Powers Necessary to the Common Defense Further Considered." It is written by Alexander Hamilton, December 21st, 1787. Topics include a need for a strong national military, and as well as don't make laws that knowingly cannot be abided by. Now that goes off a little bit with, I believe it was the Dutch Republic that had that issue where they were looking for a unanimous vote to pass any type of legislation or to declare war. Therefore, it was consistently broken, their governing document, because they could not get that unanimity vote through. So just to begin here, I'm gratefully requesting, or humbly requesting, that you watch this weekend special that I had recently. It was about Dr. Fauci, the flip-flops that he's had over time, and how he's gained such popularity, and it seems like he's everywhere. There's so many different videos and interviews with him, and he's flip-flopped on masks, he's flip-flopped on government shutdowns as well, quarantining, and a lot of the political stuff that he has done as well, stating that this bureaucrat is not a political figure when he really is a political figure, and he extols the virtues of Democrats and, goes against the Republicans. So yeah, just check that out. Just a quick synopsis, a summation of all the flip-flops are about an hour and 9 minutes into the video. That is a Washington Examiner clip. It's about 5 minutes long. It'll give you, and it's perfect to listen to, it will give you a synopsis of all of the flip-flops that have ensued from Dr. Fauci. If you're ever debating any of your liberal friends and they speak about him as a deity, such as many have, you can give them that video and say, hey, well, watch this guy flip-flop on many different issues and change his opinions over time, and really just not come in there with a organized plan on how to deal with coronavirus and how to live your lives. And yeah, he does have an impact on public policy as well. So yeah, so this one here, it is going to be the same subject from the last paper. I did do these notes a couple days ago, so I'm going to be a little rusty coming out the gate here. Hamilton begins this paper by defending the provision that the national government is to be charged with providing the common defense rather than each individual state. So to this he states, and I quote, "It may perhaps be urged that the objects enumerated in the preceding number ought to be provided for by the state governments under the direction of the Union, but this would be, in reality, an inversion of the primary principle of our political association, as it would be in practice transfer the care of the common defense from the federal head to the individual members. A project oppressive to some states, dangerous to all, and baneful to the Confederacy." End quote. So here, I guess he's going to continue to fight that he's going to argue there should be a strong national military. Now, what he's saying is the people that object to the proposed Constitution, their argument is the states should have their own militaries to defend themselves. And then, Hamilton characterizes it as a project that is oppressive to some states, dangerous to all, because you're going to have bigger states taking over the smaller states, and baneful to the Confederacy. So it could cause a dissolution, jealousy, territorial jealousy, state jealousy. So Hamilton states that some states are in more jeopardy than others, and I quote, "Upon the plan of separate provisions, New York would have to sustain the whole weight of the establishment requisite to her immediate safety and to the immediate or ultimate protection of her neighbors." End quote. So saying New York, considering the weight or the other countries that surround New York, the other territories, or even the western Native American lands, that they themselves, they have to sustain the security for all the neighboring states around them. Also, a lot of the neighboring states around them were smaller states, but they really are the gate to get through to all the other states in the Union. That was the point of that. him stating that they alone, if you could take out New York's military or the New York State's military at that point, then you can really just lay waste to the rest of America at that point. That's what he's trying to get across. And then he goes on stating, the territories of Britain, Spain, and of the Indian nations in our neighborhood do not border on particular states, but encircle the Union from Maine to Georgia. The danger, though in different degrees, is therefore common, and the means of guarding against it ought in like manner to be the objects of common councils and of a common treasury. End quote. So he's establishing, he wants a common treasury, he wants the government to have revenue coming in through taxation, and that common treasury should be paying for the national defense or the national security in guarding each individual state as a national union. And then the point is to have this national military through taxation, and then on top of that, the militia is to work in supplementing almost as a surplus force, an auxiliary, if you will, if the mobilization of national forces do not get there on time. That's really the point of the militia. So Hamilton states that some states are in more jeopardy than others. That's something I already stated there. That's something I missed. Okay, so then the states, so this is what he states next, and I quote, the states to whose lot it might fall to support the necessary establishments would be as little able as willing for a considerable time to come to bear the burden of competent provisions. The security of all would thus be subjected to the parsimony, improvidence, or inability of a part. End quote. So there's some states, what he's saying here is there's some states that are unable, just because of the mere size or the amount of commerce that they have coming through, to be able to support a necessary establishment of a military. And because that one state can easily be commandeered, that would mean that would cause the instability and and it would jeopardize the security of all the other states in the Union. So if the militaries were each ran state by state, this would open up vulnerabilities, and smaller, less prosperous states that were unable to fund a state military would now cause the entire system or the entire Union to be in jeopardy. And then he continues, and I quote, if the resources of such part becoming more abundant and extensive, its provisions should be proportionally enlarged. The other states would quickly take the alarm at seeing the whole military force of the Union in the hands of 2 or 3 of its members, and those probably amongst the most powerful. They would each choose to have some counterpoise, and pretenses could easily be contrived. End quote. So what he's saying here is some states they have far more resources and they need more security, more military forces. So if each individual state had this, we're going to have 2 or 3 states that have huge, insurmountable military forces. Thus, these random counterpoises or these pretenses could be contrived. There's going to be stories kind of made up or fabricated just because of the jealousies that would transpire amongst these individual states, because of jealousies of one military being bigger than another, what have you, or one state having more resources, more commerce than another. So Hamilton also feared that the people would be more apt to unite with the state government rather than the federal head. With the addition of military establishments, they would feel apt to overthrow the national authority. So he states, and I quote, reasons have been already given to induce a supposition that the state governments will too naturally be prone to a rivalship with that of the Union, the foundation of which will be the love of power, and that in any contest between the federal head and one of its members, the people will be most apt to unite with their local government. End quote. So here what he's saying is, if the federal head and the local government ever, and this is kind of this relates to the feudalism system that they had in Europe with the nobles of these individual lands. They called them fiefs. These individual lands that they gave to, or annals they called them, and then they gave fiefs to individuals, and then those individuals had the loyalty to the state or to the prince, and then the prince would have fights with the monarch, and he'd be able to overpower and overthrow the monarch. So here it's kind of the same thing. You're going to have loyalty to the state government or the local government rather than the federal head, just because you live in that state and you see what's done there. Now, Hamilton argues, and I quote, "The ambition of the members should be stimulated by the separate and independent possession of military forces. It would afford too strong a temptation and too great a facility to them to make enterprises upon, and finally to subvert the constitutional authority of the Union." End quote. So this is exactly what he's saying. If you have this independent possession of military forces, it would afford too strong a temptation and too great of a facility to them to make enterprises upon, and finally to subvert the constitutional authority of the Union. Thus, if you have these individual states that have these strong built-up militaries, they can easily encroach on the rights of their individual citizens. And if the national authority or the federal government under, like, let's say, there's certain inalienable rights at this time. If the state of New Jersey was actually violating its constitution and going for just a full-on, they were sending the state police around and they were going for a full-on gun grab, which I don't think would ever happen, because I don't even think state troopers would want to be knocking on people's doors, confiscating their weapons. Because considering that concealed carry holders actually have lower crime rates than police officers do. So they're a subgroup amongst very few that have a very, very low crime rate. But for example, if the state police wanted to knock on doors and they wanted to confiscate weapons, then the federal government, if there's a state military that's pretty powerful and strong, the federal government would be really unable to protect any type of liberties under the federal constitution at this time, if that was the case. And that's really what he's alluding to, is if the state wants to encroach its power and take away the rights of the citizenry, then there's really no answer from the federal government, because their military is so strong that they could do some serious damage to the federal government's military. So then Hamilton feared that people would be less safe if this were the case. He states, and I quote, "On the other hand, the liberty of the people would be less safe in this state of things than in that which left the national forces in the hands of the national government. As far as an army may be considered as a dangerous weapon of power, it had better be in those hands of which people are most likely to be jealous than in those of which they are least likely to be jealous." End quote. So here's what he's saying. There's going to be jealousy of having this military, and it had better be in those hands of which the people are most likely to be jealous than in those of which they are least likely to be jealous, which is very interesting. I think he's talking about the national forces. If we're going to, the liberty of the people would be less safe in this state of things, and then in that which left the national forces in the hands of the national government. As far as an army may be considered as a dangerous weapon of power, it had better be in those hands of which the people are most likely to be jealous. Oh, okay. So this is what I'm saying. If we're going to, this is very, very astute assumption that he makes here. Observation. It's very intelligent. So what he's saying is, if this state government, wherever the federal or wherever the military is, it should actually be in a position that the people themselves are jealous of that federal military, or rather fear them in some sort of way. Not in an actual fear, like physically fearful way, but they want to keep a check on that military and see what they're doing and what their operations, what's taking place with their operations, to make sure to keep them in check, rather. So if you have that military in the state, people are going to be less jealous of them. They're going to be less keen to watch what's going on, or less apt to pay attention to what's going on with that state military. And you can build that military up, and then eventually you can go in and take and oppress the people very quickly and swiftly, kind of under the guise of being the state military that everyone is a huge fan of and has many admirers. So Hamilton adds, and I quote, "For it is truth which the experiences of ages has attested, that the people are always most in danger when the means of injuring their rights are in the possession of those of whom they entertain the least suspicion." End quote. So he's saying the people that are of least suspicious behavior, that you would think are not going to take your rights away, very often it ends up being experiences of history. It ends up being those people that end up taking the rights away from the citizen. Now, this is something that goes on. This is prevalent to what is currently going on. A lot of people, just the government in a general sense, a lot of people are very friendly to the bureaucracy, very friendly to having their rights taken away. And actually, some of them are calling for others to get their rights taken away along with their own. They're really just kind of handing them over to the government system. For example, you have Second Amendment. You have people for holidays telling others to stay home and say they're going to stay home as well. It's very weird what's going on right now. Other people are trying to regulate the lives of regular, hardworking Americans. So then he continues here. So he states... Hamilton believed that usurpations of power would mainly persist in the state government rather than the federal head due to the trust in the state system. That's really what he's saying there. And then he states, and I quote, "There are other lights besides those already taken notice of in which the impropriety of restraints on the discretion of the national legislature will be equally manifest. The design of the objection which has been mentioned is to preclude standing armies in times of peace. Though we have never been informed how far it is designed, the prohibition should extend," end quote. So this is very interesting. What he's saying is the objectives are saying that there should be a design that we should not keep these militaries in times of peace, but there's no actual information. Because if you have a war, let's say with Germany, and Germany surrenders, are you instantly now going to just disband your entire military because you don't want to have any standing armies in times of peace? Or how long is it? What's the proportionality? How long are we going to hold on to this military until we can let them go? And he doesn't understand how far this prohibition of standing military should extend. Should it extend right after the war is over, or should it be a couple months afterwards just to make sure? So Hamilton characterizes what it would be like to have a prohibition on raising and keeping armies in times of peace. He states, and I quote, "This must undoubtedly be submitted to the national government, and the matter would then be brought to this issue that the national government, to provide against apprehended danger, might in the first instance raise troops and might afterwards keep them on foot as long as they suppose the peace or safety of the community was in any degree of jeopardy. It is easy to perceive that a discretion so latitudinary as this would afford ample room for eluding the force of this provision. The supposed utility of the provision of this kind can only be founded on the supposed probability, or at least some possibility, of a combination between the executive and legislative in some scheme of usurpation," end quote. So this is interesting. What he's saying is, and this is very significant, he's saying there could be plans devised in order to keep a standing military if we're going to have a complete prohibition of a standing military in times of peace between the executive and the legislative authority. They can write up some scheme or devise a scheme in order to make it like people are in jeopardy all of the time just to keep an establishment of a military. Because the idea of not having any type of establishment of a military is one that is futile. It is ineffective. Throughout history, I don't think it's ever really been done to have no type of military force. I know Canada doesn't have a really strong military force, but they still do have some sort of standing military, and then they also have the biggest military power in the entire world right next to them in the United States. So we actually really pay for Mexico as well as Canada. We really front the bill for their military, which people don't really understand that, because if we have a country like a Russia that's actually technically pretty close, or even China's a little bit closer, but they're actually pretty close to Canada, and they can really make a move if they wanted to on Canada. And there's these different stories about Russia north of Canada. They've been trying to take certain land because there's some sort of resources there. They sail their ships. So does China. There's all this different national security stuff going on. But the United States really fronts the bill for Canada's defense overall every single year. And that's something that's really not mentioned, just to try to protect our own borders, because we know if we have a solid friend to us in the north in a Canada, then we're willing to keep them safe as long as they're not a threat to the United States. So next, Hamilton goes on to defend the concept of standing armies in times of peace, stating, and I quote, "If to obviate this consequence, it should be resolved to extend the prohibition to the raising of armies in time of peace, the United States would then exhibit the most extraordinary spectacle which the world has yet seen, that of a nation incapacitated by its constitution to prepare for defense before it was actually invaded," end quote. So he's saying if we follow this and we put a prohibition on the keeping and the standing of standing armies keeping troops, then it'll be the first time that this has ever been done. A nation that is incapacitated by its own governing document to even defend itself. So then Hamilton continues on this note. He states, and I quote, "As the ceremony of a formal denunciation of war has of late fallen into disuse, the presence of an enemy within our territories must be waited for as the legal warrant to the government to begin its levies of men for the protection of the state. We must receive the blow before we could even prepare to return it," end quote. So this is pretty funny. So what he's pretty much saying this sarcastically. He's saying we're gonna have to wait until our enemy comes at us or attacks us. It won't be a preemptive preparation. What will happen is we'll have a more of a reactive response rather than a preactive response. We're going to have to wait to get attacked to start even raising the troops. Not even attacking back. It's to even start raising the troops, we're going to have to get attacked first. We're going to have to take a serious blow first, and then we'll actually begin to repair or prepare to return it back. So then he goes on, and I quote, "We must expose our property and liberty to the mercy of foreign invaders and invite them by our weakness to seize the naked and defenseless prey, because we are afraid that rulers created by our choice, dependent on our will, might endanger that liberty by an abuse of the means necessary to its preservation," end quote. So what he's saying is, we're going to have to allow these foreign invaders to come to our country and take us over and pretty much decimate the country because we're afraid of government officials that are supposed to be of the will of the people, and they are elected by us. That's all he's saying there. And so then Hamilton disagrees with the idea of the militia of the idea, and I quote, "The militia of the country is its natural bulwark and would be at all times equal to the national defense," end quote. So I guess that's an objector's characterization of the militia, saying that the militia is just as effective as a national military would be. So then Hamilton continues his opinion on this, and he quotes. And he states, and I quote, "This doctrine in substance had like to have lost us our independence. It cost millions to the United States that might have been saved. The facts which from our own experience forbid a reliance of this kind are too recent to permit us to be the dupes of such a suggestion," end quote. So what he's saying is during the Revolutionary War, at first we had these small militias that were fighting back against the British military or our British rulers at this time. So then the militia found itself to be ineffective. It cost the United States a lot of money. It costed individual citizens their lives and a lot of money as well. And then we instituted the Continental Army, and that was wasn't less of a militia and more of an actual regulated military that had special training. So if he was saying, all he's saying here is if we just continue with militias, we would not have our independence today. So Hamilton contends, and I quote, "The steady operations of war against regular and disciplined armies can only be successfully conducted by a force of the same kind. Considerations of economy, not less than of stability and vigor, confirm this position," end quote. So he's pretty much saying that if you look at big economies of certain individual countries, they would actually corroborate this evidence that you need a disciplined military because their economy is powerful, it is effective, and it is a trusted economy. And that would actually confirm the position that you need a standing military, because it seems like all of the really strong economies in the entire world are also held with a strong and disciplined, regulated military force. So then he states, he goes on, and Hamilton goes on to praise the militia that is accountable for the liberty of their country and outlines their bravery and fame deserved. But even those men know that, and I quote, war, like most other things, is a science to be acquired and perfected by diligence, by preservation, by time, and by practice, end quote. So he's just giving he's commending these individuals of the militia, but even the militiamen know that there needs to be some sort of a regulated military in place. So Hamilton believed that a national army, rather than militia members, that's profession isn't representative of war, would be more feasibly achieve these elements, meaning that militia members, their profession, they may be a welder, they may do, I don't know, they may be a farmer, but those professions are not aimed towards war, and that's not their profession. So thus, a national army would be much better off as a remedy. So in conclusion, Hamilton cites states such as Pennsylvania and Massachusetts that have provisions in their state doctrine that prohibit standing armies, but they still have standing armies to resolve partial disorders, insurrections, and revolts. So talking about Pennsylvania in particular, he states, and I quote, "The Bill of Rights of that state declares that standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be kept up in time of peace. Pennsylvania, nevertheless, in a time of profound peace from the existence of partial disorders in one or two of her counties, has resolved to raise a body of troops, and in all probability will keep them up as long as there is any appearance of danger to the public peace," end quote. So here what he's characterizing that you have these individual states that have different doctrines saying we're not allowed to keep standing armies, but they're still keeping the standing armies to resolve partial disorders, pretty much insurrections or revolts. And it's the same thing with Massachusetts. He goes on to state, and I quote, "The conduct of Massachusetts affords a lesson on the same subject, though on different grounds. That state, without waiting for the sanction of Congress, as the Articles of Confederation require, was compelled to raise troops to quell a domestic insurrection, and still keeps a corps in pay to prevent a revival of the spirit of revolt. The particular constitution of Massachusetts opposed no obstacle to the measure, but the instance is still of use to instruct us that cases are likely to occur under our government, as well as under those of other nations, which will sometimes render a military force in time of peace essential to the security of the society, and that it is therefore improper in this respect to control the legislative discretion," end quote. So yeah, you should not be controlling the legislative discretion as it relates to military actions. What he is referring to here in Massachusetts is the Shays Rebellion. We've covered this before. Shay and a couple of other, I think it was farmers or what have you, a couple other workers that were getting taxed heavily decided to have a rebellion in Massachusetts. They were eventually taken out by the militia, but they tried to commandeer the the Springfield Armory to arm themselves to fight against the militia, but they were eventually quelled. And that's really what he's stating here is it's another one, and they're supposed to, and I guess through the Congress, they were supposed to, if they wanted to raise troops in their state individually, they had to actually wait for sanction of Congress, and the Congress assembled through the Articles of Confederation. But they didn't even do that. They still raised troops, and now they're holding troops to stop any further revival of the spirit of revolt, which is very interesting. There, so that's really all he's saying is the legislative. It should be, there should be no control in the legislative discretion in terms of raising armies. So then he continues, and I quote, "It also teaches us in its application to the United States how little the rights of a feeble government are likely to be respected even by its own constituents, and it teaches us, in addition to the rest, how unequal parchment provisions are to a struggle with public necessity," end quote. So what he's saying here is we have the Articles of Confederation. They said that you have to get approval from them to raise troops and army or military in your individual state. They did not follow this doctrine. Massachusetts, they went on their own will to protect their state. They activated the militia to quell the Shays Rebellion, and that's just what Hamilton is alluding to, is that it just shows how weak our current government document is, that it is so feeble that states don't care and they just do their own thing and they violate it. So in conclusion here, He states, and I quote, "It was a fundamental maxim of the Lacedaemonian Commonwealth," I think that is Sparta, like old Sparta, "that the post of admiral should not be conferred twice on the same person. The Peloponnesian confederates, having suffered a severe defeat at sea from the Athenians, demanded Lysander, who had before served with success in that capacity, to command the combined fleets. The Lacedaemonians, to gratify their allies and yet preserve the semblance of an adherence to their ancient institutions, had recourse to the flimsy subterfuge of investing Lysander with the real power of admiral under the nominal title of vice admiral. This instance is selected from among a multitude that might be cited to confirm the truth already advanced and illustrated by domestic examples, which is that nations pay little regard to rules and maxims calculated in their very nature to run counter to the necessities of the society," end quote. So really what he's saying is we should not be calling for provisions that are counter-narrative to what our actual necessities are as a government. So from what I understand here is the Confederacy, I guess this was the Greek Confederacy that he's citing here. They demanded that this guy named Lysander command the combined fleets, and and this is right after they lost to the Athenians. I guess this was old Sparta at the time. They lost to the Athenians in the war. They demanded this guy Lysander commanded the combined fleets, and then to gratify their allies and yet preserve the semblance of an adherence to the ancient institutions, had recourse to the flimsy subterfuge of investing Lysander with the real power of admiral under the nominal title of vice admiral. This instance is selected from among a multitude. So what he's talking about here is that you had an individual, you put them at the position of vice admiral to really circumvent the rules of whatever type of republic they had at that time. I guess they could not have an admiral that really held the full power. So they had this guy, they put him up as vice admiral, but he really was the admiral, and he had full military strength and power. So what's being said here is by Hamilton is don't set rules that you know are going to be broken just because these rules are counter-narrative to the actual necessities of the society. So then Hamilton continues on this note, and this is, I think, his very last message here. He states, and I quote, "Wise politicians will be cautious about fettering the government with restrictions that cannot be observed, because they know that every breach of the fundamental laws, though dictated by necessity, impairs that sacred reverence which ought to be maintained in the breast of rulers toward the constitution of a country, and forms a precedent for other breaches where the same plea of necessity does not exist at all, or is less urgent and palpable," end quote. So this is probably one of the most important quotes, and maybe it's underrated. I'm not really sure what people think of it. This by far is one of the most important quotes that I've seen so far. So what he's saying is, you have these politicians, they are elected by the people. Don't set and make rules that you know are not going to be followed, because this person that you choose to, this government official that is elected, you choose to follow the rules and maintain the country. They're supposed to have a reverence towards the constitution of the country, almost a deferment, meaning the constitution comes before whatever they actually are thinking, and the constituents, as in the people themselves at large, come much more before of what their individual thoughts are, and the constitution comes before that as well. So what he's saying is, if you're setting up a system for this government official, this elected official, to fail and usurp their power and violate the Constitution, you can't set up a system like that, because then you set a precedent where it's easier to breach the Constitution over and over again, because I did it. The precedent is, I did it there, I can do it here. It's actually very similar to what we're seeing in Supreme Court cases, where they will say, even years ago when the Supreme Court did not follow the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence with a lot of race issues, saying that there needed to be some sort of a segregation of school system, these people had to be treated differently than these people. That is not a constitution. There's no constitutional argument to actually provide for that. The Constitution is written so everyone's supposed to be treated equally. That's why it did not really make any sense. But that was the will of the Supreme Court justices at that time. They said, oh, well, we think we take the Constitution, we pretty much wipe our butts with it, and then this is what we want. And there's like one, word in the Constitution to support what we say. They take something and they over-exaggerate it, or they manipulate it, move the words around in a way and say, oh, I interpret it this way, to really meet their standards for what they want to implement in society. So that's really what was going on. It was not the document, it was the people. And that's really what he's alluding to, Hamilton, here, is that you want to set up a system so people don't usurp the power, and this is why I said this in case law, the Supreme Court ruled that there should be segregation, and then you have to sit there and you have to fight the Supreme Court and go back to the Supreme Court over and over again, because now they set the precedent. That's the precedent. Oh, there has to be segregation. Now you have to fight through Supreme Court cases to eliminate the segregation. So, in other words, Hamilton's saying here, making rules knowingly that cannot be followed sets a dangerous precedent for politicians to overstep their power, and with that become friendlier to the idea of usurping their powers with the same justification and energy. So that really concludes this one. That is the main staple. That is the theme, is that you should not of really the entire Constitution, I would say, is you should not set a precedent that or you should not set rules in place that cannot be followed, because then when they're broken, you set the precedent that anything can be broken at this point. Who cares? And that also speaks to a wider standard of, toppling of statues, especially George Washington. A lot of our founders is, if you could topple their statues, then what's the precedent? You can get rid of the Constitution too on top of that. So yeah, that'll be it for this one. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Like I said, please check out that Fauci video I put up about an hour and 9 minutes in. You're going to see a full 5-minute display of the flip-flops from Fauci, so that'll be interesting. And that is really it. That concludes this one. That concludes this video. I greatly appreciate everybody for tuning in. I will see you all on Wednesday. Thank you.